All right, folks, let's get started. I am Michael Roller. I'm an archaeologist here, National Park Service at the Washington Support Office here in Washington, D.C. It's a chilly day here in D.C. This is the ArcheoThursday Topics in Archaeology webinar series. It's our second this year. And we have a great presentation for you today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. The presentation will be recorded and archived, and we'll put it up on our website, captioned as well. That'll take a little while, but you can always contact me if you are interested earlier to hear a recording from the webinar. A bit of housekeeping, please make sure that your phones are on mute while the presenters are presenting. We'll have about a 45-minute presentation, 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll have some time for question and answer. The presenter said it's okay if you ask questions, if you're moved to ask a question in the course of the presentation. You can also ask a question through the chat. I'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation. So there's a lot of content here, a lot of fantastic content. So just if you feel moved, go ahead and ask a question. The topic of our presentation today will be on a collaborative historical ecology project of a Tolowa village on the north coast of California. And we're lucky to have three presenters here from the three different collaborating groups on this project. We have Shannon Tushingham, who is part of the Department of Anthropology at Washington State University. We have Michael Peterson from the National Park Service, Redwood National Historic Site and State Parks. And we have Suntayea Steinruck, representative from the Tolowa Dee-ni Nation of Crescent City, California. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to pass this over to Shannon.
Thanks, Mike. Great to be here. Really appreciate the invitation. And we're excited to share with you some of our research today that was conducted on the north coast of California. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world, and really special group here that we're bringing together. So it's me, Suntayea Steinruck, and Michael Peterson. The three of us worked on this project. Could you go to the next slide, please?
Shannon, sorry, this is Suntayea really quick. Just to make it clear, though, that I am a member of Tolowa Dee-ni Nation and the former TIPO for the tribe. Just so we know where I'm coming from. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's something I was going to point out for sure. This is the project that we'll be talking about is an explicitly cooperative and multidisciplinary effort that was conducted between tribal communities in Northern California, an academic institution, an agency, and some CRM people. And it involved a lot of people. Some of them are, you'll see on this slide here. And it's a project that was, I got involved in when I was a TIPO for the Elk Valley Rancheria, which is a tribal community in Northern California. And Suntayea was a TIPO at that point in time too. So we've both moved on. She's living in Western Washington, and I'm living in Eastern Washington, working at Washington State University. And Mike Peterson, there in the sort of center on the bottom of the slide, he's still working for the National Park Service. So this project was completed about 2 years ago, and it was conducted through a cooperative ecosystem unit or CSU agreement between Washington State University and the National Park Service. And it's part of a larger effort to address impacts to cultural resources at this location, and it involved other agreements that I'll touch on, but the focus here will really be on what I did at Washington State University and the research that is summarized in this capstone article that was published earlier this year. So is that good, Suntayea? That's kind of where...
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks.
Okay, yeah. And so we published this article in the Journal of Island and Coastal Archaeology, and it was a little bit different because it really was talking about not just the archaeological research, which is sort of a typical type of article that would be published in this journal. This also really brought front and center our work that was revolved around this approach that we term collaborative historical ecology, which I'll be discussing here today. Slide. So the location that we are talking about is right at the border of Oregon and California. It's in Redwood National and State Parks. This is an area that includes many cultural resources, and it's also home to the Tolowa Dee-ni. Slide. This is a sort of a bird's eye view of the location here. So you can see the red arrow points out Redwood National and State Parks, and it's part of this sort of coast redwood range that that extends all the way up from San Francisco Bay up into southwestern Oregon. Slide. This is sort of, if anybody's been, if you have not been to this area, I highly recommend going. This is just a wonderful place. It's where, in case you didn't know, Bigfoot lives here. And it's a great place to visit. It's just rugged coastline. It's the land of redwood forests and drive-through trees and all kinds of really wonderful places to explore, including Redwood National and State Park. So they have quite a few campgrounds and really beautiful places to visit that are especially popular in the summertime. Slide. This area is also home to, of course, numerous indigenous communities, including the Tolowa of southwestern Oregon and northwestern California. And their homelands extend throughout this area. There are about 5,000 square miles, and they're 30% of lands that Redwood National and State Parks collectively or collaboratively administer. So it's a significant portion of the land base. And, you know, for many, many years, the National Park Service has worked with indigenous communities in the area, developing these relationships far before, you know, much longer than I've been working in the area. So these are relationships that are, you know, extend to today, and they go pretty far back in time. Slide. So it's really important to, you know, talk about we're going to be talking a lot about archaeology, but also the fact that people are, these are living communities, and I think Suntayea is going to talk a little bit about this.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon. Excuse my cold, so bear with me here. In this slide, we're just, you know, sharing some of our traditions and cultures that date back, you know, to time immemorial. So right here we have our Nadash ceremony. There's a line of girls, and our regalia is made from natural materials that we gather, and then also materials that we've traded. So there's glass beads and other things that we've incorporated into our regalia. I also wanted to share our living culture that we still practice our traditional food and life ways on the beach in numerous other parts of our territory as well. But these two pictures indicate, like, they're showing our, you know, using marine resources and also the various generations accessing the beach. We were making a sand bread pit here, and we were laughing because it was one of our first ones that we ever made, and it was too big to begin with, so we really had to downsize that pit and make it a lot smaller so that we could cook our bread in the rocks. And the gentleman with the net is my brother, Steinruck, and he's using a small dip net to gather some sand crabs so we could go fishing for perch. I'm just sharing that because it's part of who we are, to share who we are and how we live in this world, in the environment, and how these resources were used traditionally and today.
Thanks, Suntayea. Slide. So the archaeological site and cultural resources that we're going to be discussing really center around the coast. And we're particularly going to be talking about the summer place, which is, Suntayea, can you pronounce this for me?
Shin-yvslh-sri.
Thank you. And I'll be Shin-yvslh-sri. And I'll be referring to this as the summer place, just so I don't butcher that name throughout. The site trinomial is California CADNO 14. Can you hit the slide?
And Shannon, one of the cool things that we've been able to develop over the years, I think, is that collaborative work where you would say the number, because I had no idea what that really meant, and then I would bring in the name of the place in our language so that we would have both those to refer to.
Yeah, exactly. That's that translation thing that we kind of laugh about and go back and forth with, because I'm sort of, I'm thinking of this place as, CADNO 14, and other people are scratching their head and saying, no, this is a village, this is the name and everything. So, thanks for sharing that. And really, that's something that we're going to be talking about quite a bit. So, in archaeological practice, there's this tradition to talk about pre-contact sites and archaeology as if everything is kind of in the past, and that's something that we're really explicitly trying to change. I mean, you see this in the discipline. That's a trend in the discipline, but that's definitely something that we underscore in our study and our work together. So it's, developing those ties from living people to the past. And so one of the interesting things, when you're doing cultural resources work in this area is that there's not a lot of formal ethno-historic data. This map that you see here is a Tolowa Village map that was published by Philip Drucker in 1937, and he plotted out all of the village sites that he could find out about. And he didn't really spend a whole lot of time in this area. He just was recording as much as he could at the time. And he mapped out village sites and other important food procurement locations, so places where people gathered acorns and got smelt and salmon and that sort of thing. But we know it's incomplete, and there's several reasons. First, it was because he was only able to interview a few people. But the other one is that the Tolowa suffered massive population decimation. They were subjected to genocide. There were massacres in the area, and their population was just absolutely decimated by this violence. And before that, there were waves of disease that came through this area. So when we talk about the ethno-historic data, it's really important to remember that it's flawed. And there was this tradition in anthropology for quite a while to sort of not recognize that and act as if whatever was being recorded by these early ethnographers was what was true. And we know that there's a lot that a lot of things that we need to fill in the blanks for. So, so part of this is, there's actually, despite everything that's happened, there is a remarkable amount of information that is living in the oral histories, in people's minds. There's stories that have been passed down. And so for me, it's been wonderful to work with folks that are willing to share that information. And so this area, this is pointing out the village site from the village location, and you'll see on Drucker's map, he did not plot out Summer Place, but he did include a nearby village site at Cushion Creek, and this is an engraving of what it looked like in 1854. So this is right around the gold rush era. This is sort of the height of when people were being subjected to a lot of violence, and were basically, it was a very bad time in this area. So it's
Schmidt.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's a hard one.
That's a thank you. Slide. So the area, we know these places are along the coast. We sort of have a general idea of where these sites are located. Many of them have been mapped out to greater or lesser degrees, but this place, the Summer Place, really has had some cultural resource issues, and as I say here, this was a recipe for a cultural resources disaster, because, I mean, if you think about a lot of these places, the reason why people camped there in the past, or the reason why people like to, they're drawn to these places. This was a beautiful coastline. There's really rich tide pools. Visitors love to come down here, and you see quite a bit of visitation at this beach. This is increasing quite a bit, and the only way you can get to the tide pools and the beach really is or the most direct route is to go through the site, and you'll see the people on the right-hand side are walking on this volunteer trail that really has some very fragile midden deposits. And this area is subjected to tsunamis. There's worsening climatic trends that are, are things that people are really having to deal with. Slide. So some of the visitor impacts, I just wanted to include a slide here. We do see illegal camping quite a bit. When I first learned about this site, I got called in as a TIPO to document these illegal campfire pits. People were, hopefully unknowingly digging pits right in the midden site, doing a lot of damage to these places, camping where they're not supposed to camp. There were volunteer trails. Slide. And the resource managers are dealing with a situation where you have human remains that are eroding out of cut banks, people just not knowing, or, we're not sure if people were looting or they're unknowingly taking items from the site. But you can see on the left-hand side, there's an enormous amount of midden that's being lost. And really, this has been tracked systematically, mostly within the last 10 years. So we're not really sure how much has been lost, but there certainly has been quite a bit of damage. Slide. Mike Peterson has done quite a bit of work on this in this regard, and you can see this graphic kind of shows how much loss there has been to the site just in the last few years. Mike, did you want to say anything at this point about some of this documentation?
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. I just wanted to say that over the last, about every year, we've seemed to have lost almost up to 10 centimeters of deposits each year due to variances in your weather patterns and higher tides and just the amount of erosion and visitor impacts. But I'm trying to reduce that. We to have addressed the visitors' impacts. And so I guess this slide here is a slide of one of the cliff faces out near the cultural locations. It shows the loss over time. I started documenting this back in about 2009 and up to 2016, where the red line is at. That's how much sediment has been lost. There were, I think, people during historic periods where maybe like 80 years ago were kind of seeing that same amount of erosion at this particular cliff face. They actually installed like bollards, or they put big piers down below the cliff face, and I can actually start to see how those piers helped stop the erosion. So it's definitely hard to keep the erosion back, and so that's
Thanks,
all I have for that.
Next slide. So the Park Service, over the years, I just remember getting called in when I was working for the tribe, and you would have different, something eroded out, and there would be sort of these emergencies that we'd go down to the site and try and deal with. Every time that happens, we would communicate and talk about like what could we do, what could happen here, and the Park Service, to their great credit, has really taken the bull by the horns, and they have this resource protection project that involves a lot of different activities. And you'll see they have in this graphic, they've outlined the Nickel Creek APE. So there's this whole area that they're kind of coming at with a different management approaches. Slide. And some of these things I won't get into too much. If you guys want to talk about jute cloth, I'm sure Mike can answer all those questions. There's lots of different resource protection measures that they've been involved with, from developing resource protection signage, new kiosks, getting people off those volunteer trails, and coming up with all of these different solutions. And as many of you know, who work in this kind of business, this is can be a lot of work, and it's really involved a co-management attitude where new campground maps, slide, social engineering and erosion control. So they established coyote brush in some of these social trails, and they've made some very significant headway in protecting the archaeological site and cultural resources in this area. And it's a tough place to do this because it's so fragile, and you can see just it's in these pictures everything is blue skies, but when a storm rolls in, it's impactful, to say the least. I think Mike has told me that he's seen huge logs, redwood logs, just moved around from place to place on these beaches, and so they're dealing with an uphill battle. Slide. Some more pictures of the resource protection fence, and the idea behind this fence was to keep people away from this cliff face that was very sensitive archaeologically. Now, the fence construction is important here because this solution also created a little bit of a challenge, because the fence posts, of course, you need to excavate into the ground. So each of those fence posts, the Park Service knew was going to impact the archaeological site. So the question then became, well, how would we handle this? Should we try and recover information, archaeological information, from these midden deposits as we're installing the fence posts? And Suntayea and Mike, I don't know if you wanted to just mention anything about this decision at this point, or if you wanted to chime in later on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Suntayea, or I can.
Okay. You know, that was one of the, like you said, Shannon, it was a hard decision because we were trying to figure out, you know, the greater impacts versus the impacts of putting in barriers or, you know, what we could use. And so I felt that the, you know, parks did a great job in meeting with us and the tribe and the TIPO offices to say, okay, well, what can we do? We can't really get huge boulders down there at this point because the road's changed and, you know, the use of different things. And so we were talking about what we could do. And so, you know, in the end, we, you know, I know for me, I'm just speaking from my experience, I kind of had a hard time thinking, okay, we're going to be digging in this area. But in the end, the greater picture would be that, you know, we're preventing folks from going out to that bluff and creating other issues that we would have to deal with later. So, you know, I felt like we talked about it. We weighed out the, you know, odds and the ends of things and like how it would work out. And in the end, I think that I'm hoping that it's doing a good job down there. I haven't been down there in 2 years, so, you know, I felt like it was a good decision. And we decided, well, since we're taking the soil out, we might as well, you know, see what's in there and what's going on inside that. I don't know, Mike, you got more?
Yeah, thank you, Suntayea. This is Mike Peterson. I wanted to mention that, you know, we as archaeologists think of them as archaeological sites, but with a name, with Shin-yvslh-sri and directly affiliated with living cultures and people here today, it's definitely a cultural site. And you know, and with the importance of the inherent significance of this location it was just important to really get these things protected. And it was really the first stage was just talking to our constituents, the tribes, Elk Valley Rancheria and Tolowa Dee-ni Nation, and making good connections like with Suntayea and many others, Kevin and Maylou from Elk Valley. But we'll talk about that here. Shannon will mention that here in the upcoming slides. But definitely it was starting with the tribes and working with having this issue out here and trying to solve it in definite collaboration with the tribes. It's been a great project. So go ahead, Shannon.
Thanks, Mike. So at this point, I was already at Washington State, and I was contacted about working with some of the archaeological data, and this is kind of where we got into this idea of collaborative historical ecology. And I would say that throughout this process, it was something that was really, we intentionally made this process very flexible. So as I'm speaking about the research design and some of the analyses that we did, all of this was established through communications with the tribe and the Park Service, extensive communications, and sort of looking at the different possibilities with archaeological resources, research and analyses. And you know, basically what I would do is sort of, you know, we didn't know exactly what we would find in the archaeological deposits, and what I would do is sort of talk about, present a suite of options that we could go after. So, you know, if we wanted to do faunal analyses or obsidian sourcing or different things, and sort of look at trying to establish what the common research goals were. But in terms of developing this approach, we really brought community concerns and indigenous knowledge front and center with the academic, you know, sort of scientific knowledge as well. And we wanted to make that something explicit as we moved forward with mitigating site impacts, and our overarching goal of really trying to gain a more complete picture of you know, how people have been working within the ecology of Northern California. Slide. what we see, historical ecology, this is this can be a really useful framework for people that can be, actually when we started doing this, I didn't realize that it had been defined in this way, and I found this quote and I thought, oh, this is basically what we're doing. And it's really the idea of collaboration among differently trained researchers and developing a contact zone where we recognize that we all have different goals and approaches and outlooks and training and that sort of thing, but valuing that on an equal footing and also talking about those things and just being open and honest with each other. So the idea here is to develop a kind of intellectual contact zone where you can exchange information and try and come up with solutions to these problems. So this was a very complex scenario, and this seemed to work for us. Slide. And I would say in terms of collaboration and communication, this was something that the communication went back very, very far, and the Park Service was engaged with this in the very earliest stages of project planning. And we're talking about very long-term relationships. And, we sort of were thinking about, when we wrote this article, one of the reviewers asked us to be more explicit about what we meant by, what were successful strategies. And one of them was to, have a good sense of humor, and it was nice if you all kind of got along and had some humility, if you were open to other perspectives. And, but we recognize that you have to have this sort of individual commitment to collaboration, and it does take a long time. So that can be a challenge for resource managers when you don't have a lot of time, or, there are constraints there. So that is important to think about. And it's also, it's so dependent on personalities and developing those long-term relationships. That's hard to really just, magically appear. You also need a lot of top-down support too, because the nature of this kind of work is that it's more time-consuming, it can be costly, and so getting the buy-in from your managers or supervisors is really helpful in terms of, engaging in this kind of extensive collaboration. Suntayea and Mike, do you guys have anything to say here? Am I missing anything?
This is Mike. I'll cut in here. One of the things are definitely wait for the tribal folks to talk first, but Suntayea, I better just say how great it was working with you, and I think one of the things that helped to facilitate collaboration is just get out in the field with your tribal partners. Just get away from those office meetings, get out in the field where you can really start to meet and walk along and enjoy the weather. And that's definitely what we've done here at the Park Service at Redwood National Park with our tribal partners. Just get out in the field, and it's just more of a relaxed atmosphere a lot of times, and then go back into your meetings and talk more inside the office when it's raining or snowing or something like raining up here. That's what I have there. Go ahead, Suntayea, if you have anything.
Okay. Yeah, I was, trying to think on, what does a good model look like, and I think both of you have touched a lot on what I was already thinking, but just to kind of reiterate, my thought process here, and it's so important that, when working and collaborating together, that we validate the living people and the living communities and the connection that they have to those that came before us, because we're actually, looking back on those that came before, so we're protecting, we're advocating, we're doing all these things with passion from a place that is like deep in who we are. And so to have that validation from outside agencies is vital. And so we're not only doing that, but then we're also planning for the future. So a lot of our work is to make sure that our future generations have the same ability that we have and the passion that we have, that they can then look back and say, okay, my ancestors did this, so now I need to do this. So, you know, being able to come together and recognizing that we're working together collaboratively on, you know, bringing together our strengths and differences is the way that I felt was the most important way to work in moving forward with any protection of resource management. And also, like I said, using the strengths of others. So, you know, for me, I'm not very tech savvy. I'm not the best map reader. So I would rely on Michael to come out and do that for me, or to do the, you know, GPSing or whatnot. And so those were the things that I think, you know, we were able to find that balance of bringing strengths to each other, but also having that mutual respect. And, you know, I'm going to be honest, there were times that we were out working together and, you know, we all have what we're bringing to the table from our agencies and, you know, if it's funding or if it's things like that, we all have our when we meet at the table, we're not all going to always get along. We're not always going to agree 100%. But I think finding that mutual respect for hearing each other, understanding where that perspective is coming from, is the only way you can embrace moving forward in a good way with any project. And so those were the kind of the things I was thinking of, because it is like a web where everything is connected, and if one strand is broken, then...
Uh-oh. Are you there?
Yeah. So that was just kind of what I was thinking about as far as, like, being able to collaborate and communicate. And one of the things, Shannon, that you mentioned when I was a TIPO that was so important to me was the communication up front. Even just with the thought of a project within our territory or within our lands or whatever we were talking about, just the thought of it, that's when I would want to be brought in. Because if you start planning things and then bring us in at, like, let's say the project's already 70% thought out and planned, you've had all these planning meetings without the tribal presence there or our input, and then we are brought in at the last minute. It's, you know, it's not that respectful dialogue that you can have right from the beginning. And so, you know, I always advocated that, you know, well, when are you thinking about doing it? Okay, let's all get on the same page together and let's work from there. Don't, you know, try not to bring me in when you're already 5 meetings in and you don't want to change anything, or you've already spent $500,000 over here to do this planning when we could have moved this bridge over, you know, however many feet, and now it's too late. So those are the things that I felt were important, that, you know, we were able to come together and at least talk about it, say, okay, this is what our standard practice is going to be, that we're going to talk and communicate up front. So.
Yeah. That's awesome. Thanks, Suntayea. Next slide. And these are just some pictures of these long-term relationships, some, you know, that reflect some of what we were talking about, that back and forth dialogue and just being out there in the field and enjoying each other's company and learning from each other. So I think as an archaeologist, for me, it's been really meaningful. You know, after I got my PhD at UC Davis, I got the job working for Elk Valley Rancheria, and it was, you know, another education for me. I was so fortunate to be able to work for Elk Valley Rancheria because, you know, I learned about all of the things that you don't learn in school, and when in typical academic training, and I was really fortunate to hear about tribal perspectives and, you know, see the sort of what they need to go through to protect resources in their area. Also, and it broadened my view of cultural resources too, and I know this has come out with Suntayea because I am just thinking about, you know, I was so trained about just looking at archaeological sites, but you see this broader vision of natural and cultural resources, and just even, you know, looking at the sense of place and the animals and plants that are around, and considering all of these different things that are important to cultural resources. Next slide. So a lot of our work was about translation, and I've kind of hinted at that a little bit. And this can be as literal as translating scientific names and common names into indigenous words for different taxa that you identify in the archaeological deposits. And so on the right-hand side is a table that shows the Tolowa Dee-ni name for many of the animals, the coastal animals in this region. And this was pretty cool because we had this in the article, and we wanted to really explicitly show that it was important to include Tolowa words along with the scientific and common names. So translation in that sense, and then also this theme of varied goals and perspectives, and just trying to understand. I'm getting a little feedback. Hopefully that's not coming on your end too. Slide. So as we were working on this project, we used multiple lines of evidence, and this kind of comes out with, not just looking at the archaeological data, but we looked at some of the early ethno-historic data, oral histories, and we incorporated traditional ecological knowledge of the modern community. So as far as archaeological data, we looked at legacy collections from Michael Morato's work at the site in 1972, and then we compared his work to the fence post construction. Slide. So Michael Morato is an archaeologist. He works in cultural resource management now in Southern California, and he's a local to Del Norte County. And in 1972, you can see his old school tent down there on the coast. This is at the archaeological site. And we found this picture in the archives, and that helped us kind of reconstruct where he put his units. Because if any of you have worked with legacy collections or trying to reconstruct what archaeologists did back in the day, sometimes it's hard to figure out exactly where they put units. Mike Morato did a good job, but he didn't have GPS units, obviously. He also didn't have a large budget, so we were able to actually fill in a lot of the gaps that existed during his field work. So, slide. Here's another picture of his test excavation in 1972 at the site. So he excavated a few units in the area, and basically the materials were reported in a CRM report that had been put together, and we spent a lot of time reanalyzing those materials and redrawing profiles from his work and reconstructing basically what he did to compare to our research. Slide. Mike had also worked with Amelia Brown, and she was 100. Let me see, was it 108 or 103? I can't remember. 104 years old. She's a Tolowa elder in 1972, and she was a remarkable woman, and who was fondly remembered in the Tolowa community. And I've heard about her since first working in Tolowa country, because she was very generous with her knowledge, not just with other Tolowa people, but with visiting ethnographers and archaeologists at the time. And she really played a role in the burgeoning field of ethnoarchaeology. So Richard Gould is an archaeologist who worked with her in the early 1960s. And she and Lydia George, you can see her, the both of them pointing out a house pit at Point St. George, is another archaeological site in the region, to Dr. Gould back in the day. And she and other elders worked really closely with him. And he developed this explicitly ethno-archaeological approach where he would talk to elders after finding certain tools and archaeological remains and ask them, well, what do you think this was for? Do you remember using these plants and animals and that sort of thing? And that really enriched his research in a very profound way. And so in 1972, Mike Morato asked Richard Gould for an introduction to Grandma Amelia Brown, as she's affectionately known in the area. And she said okay, and they took her out to Summer Place, and they asked her about some of the remains, the archaeological remains that Mike Morato was finding in his excavation. So they asked her about primarily salmon and some of the shellfish and different tools and that sort of thing. And this is kind of foreshadows what I'm going to be mentioning in a minute. She kept going back to smelt, which are a small forage fish, even though Morato didn't ask about it. So we were able to get a lot of information from oral histories that he had recorded, but had not been fully transcribed. We found a copy of the interview. We transcribed that, and we looked really carefully at what she was saying in that interview, and it was incredibly rich, because she remembered. Basically, she had memories that went back to the late 1800s, the 1870s, when she was a young girl living at the village next to the Summer Place. So she could remember what people were doing, how many houses were there, and all of that information that would have been, lost had we not found those oral histories. Next slide. And then here we are with the archaeological sample from 2016. So we had 7 fence posts, so we had 7 units. And these are some of the people that were involved in the excavations. It was the National Park Service, and we had tribal representatives out there, and Humboldt State University was conducting that research. Slide. They then transferred the soil from these fence posts up to Washington State University, where we floated all of this material. And at this point, this is sort of where we were deciding, we were making dynamic decisions about what sort of analyses we would do. And, we did quite a bit of, radiocarbon dating. We wanted to compare what we were finding to what Morato was finding. We did some obsidian sourcing, and we also really focused on dietary remains, because in our conversations, it became apparent that a real priority was to better understand the different plants and animals that people were using at this location. And we also conducted some ancient DNA analyses of fish, dog, and whale bones. So it was a pretty exciting, these were exciting developments to get involved with. Slide. And I'm just putting this up here to sort of compare. We talk in the article about macro versus micro scale data, and this is something to keep in mind if you are dealing with a situation where you have legacy collections. I know I direct a museum here, and we have a lot of legacy collections where you don't always have all the information that you want. Back in the day, the focus was on large scale excavations. This is not from the Summer Place. This is from another coastal site in Tolowa country, Point St. George, where people would, have these huge exposures and trenches, and they often did not, screening was optional. They did things like shovel casting, which basically means you would, take a shovel full of dirt and cast it in the air, and whatever artifacts you saw, you would collect. Faunal remains and shellfish were often not systematically collected or recorded, people were really focused on getting information through diagnostic artifacts or as well as looking for features and that sort of thing. And so, and there's no doubt that you can get a lot of information through this sort of macro scale analysis slide. But it's great if you can also compare it to micro-scale analyses. And that's what we really, you know, this was a gap that we were able to fill in our approach with the new field work. And like I said, all of the dirt from these fence posts was sent up to Washington State, and we floated everything. We wanted to preserve whatever we possibly could. And this gave us the chance to really look for, you know, missing gaps in the data, looking for charred plant remains, fish and faunal bone, and shellfish. And this involved a great deal of work on the part of my students. Next slide. This is very time-consuming work. You know, there's flotation, so this is sort of water separation where you're trying to find these materials, size sorting, sorting shell, and identifying the different materials as best you can. Slide. And here we have you know, these students put in countless hours sorting through these materials, and this basically shows, this is a time lapse of, I think this is about 12 minutes long, of somebody sorting through a small pile of sifted dirt and looking for smelt bones. So we're finding in these remains, what was really exciting was that we were finding thousands of tiny smelt bone. Slide. There's some of the smelt bones. So you can see smelt vertebra. There's some rib bones in there. We had some cranial fragments as well. There's a papermate pencil in the bottom for scale. And I've got to hand it to my students for really working on this kind of stuff. Now, these remains, you know, if you think about how tiny these are, these would go through, they go through 1/4-inch mesh. You can catch some of them with 1/4-inch, but 16-inch, you'll get most of them. Oh, you'll get all of them. And really, they were obviously overlooked using the macro scale methods. And when we started really tracking these at coastal sites, we've found that, you know, it was very clear that smelt were an important component to the diet. And they were something that in the archaeological literature had not really been emphasized. Slide. So the emphasis was more about salmon and terrestrial mammals and acorns and other foods, but smelt were really important. This also led to some work that was spearheaded by a Washington State University undergraduate, Erica Palmer, that's her on the left-hand side. And she's an undergraduate. She actually graduated, and now she's in nursing school. But she wrote an honors thesis on some of the work that she got involved with as an intern. So she was one of the people that was sorting through all these materials, and she got really curious about the smelt. And we had a lot of conversations about what I had heard about smelt fishing among the Tolowa and how important it was. And you know, the fact that we didn't really know what the species were, because there's more than one species of smelt. And there's various reasons why that's important, but we thought, okay, well, let's work with my colleague Brian Kemp, who was at Washington State at the time. He's a specialist in ancient DNA. And we wanted to see, can we extract DNA from these tiny vertebrae? We just didn't know at the time if we could. And the answer is yes, and so Erica was the first author on this paper that discusses the ancient DNA analysis of an identification of smelt vertebrae to the species level. So that was an exciting outcome of this research. Slide. So the archaeological data, what was really interesting here is that our data really corroborated much of what Mrs. Brown's oral testimony hinted at. So, like I said, the archaeologist had, Murado had asked her, well, what about, salmon? You see in these transcripts, they're talking about everything except for smelt. And she kept telling them, well, this is a place where I used to fish as a young girl. And, I used to be at fish camp, and this was really important. And she talked about her uncle, who's in this picture here, who was a great smelt fisherman and apparently would trade smelt, dried smelt all over Tolowa country. So there were these pieces in the oral testimony that really connected well with the archaeological data, which was really exciting. Slide. It was also really neat, too, because smelt are a very important resource today, and they're actually a threatened species right now. Next. I know we're kind of strapped for time here, but I'm hoping that maybe Suntayea can talk about smelt a little bit here. And fish camp.
Yeah, this is pictures of fish camp. Traditionally catch them with the V-frame net, and then we would dry them out with the sun. So they kind of evolved because we were able to use logs if they're available, like if there's big storms and the logs would wash, down the river into the ocean. We could use those to dry the fish. Or, we'd also make beds out of the sand and then put gravel on top so that your fish is not in direct contact with sand. And then we also, some of the families have developed into using other means that are like resources that are on the beach. So we started, my family in particular, started using the European beach grass, which is an invasive species. But we started cutting that, and we would put that down on the beds, and so that was like a barrier for the fish between the sand. And then those can last up to 2 years if you don't get them wet or in a damp area once they're dried.
Thanks. Slide. And just a few pictures of these camps this is from the 1960s. This is an image taken by Richard Gould, I believe. And then also connecting it to traditional ecological knowledge. So this is another study that the Park Service conducted with the indigenous communities in the area. And you'll see fish camp is really important. And the smelt and forage fish in general have been in declining numbers, but people are still going and camping every summer. It's a really important practice that people are really concerned about, and is a living, breathing thing that's happening now. Slide. So I just want to kind of, again, reiterate that this is one of the really cool things here about the work that we're doing. It's connecting these ancient traditions to living traditions. And we see this time and again where there are these very deep and long-lasting connections. Slide. So here are a few slides that Suntayea shared of she and her family harvesting coastal foods. Suntayea, did you want to speak about this?
Briefly, I just wanted to share, we were able to catch some red-tailed perch this year. We also had a bake out on we actually gathered rocks and built fire, and then we were able to cook the seafood right there on the beach with steam and a hot fire with the rocks. And then we were able to share with each other the last little bit of smelt that we did have from previous years, and that's the picture on the bottom left. And then I also shared a picture of cooking salmon on a stick, which is my favorite way to eat the salmon. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's delicious. Slide. few more pictures. Slide. I think we'll go through these quickly here just to make sure we have enough time, and just broader impacts in terms of and I don't think I have time to get into this too much, but really in terms of public access, I might discuss this later. I just want to say that, you know, as far as my students, this really brought in, this was really meaningful for a lot of my students, even though we're up here in Eastern Washington State and they were so far away. You know, I make sure with my interns that they really get something out of this. So explaining sort of like why they're floating all this material and trying to explain to them, you know, this is why we're doing what we're doing. This is why smelt bone are so important, and that sort of thing. And I think that really brings the what we do in the lab, makes it alive for them. So seeing these pictures, you know, Suntayea sharing those pictures and this information with us gives another level of meaning for myself and my students, which has been wonderful. Slide. And just in terms of broader impacts, it's just important to recognize too that a lot of these traditional foods, you know, speaking as archaeologists, we can try and intersect with some of what's going on with tribal communities trying to maintain access to traditional foods, keeping these practices alive, thinking about indigenous food sovereignty, and you know, healthy foods programs and that sort of thing. And again, that's why I think it's important to try and translate what our archaeological data and make those things useful for tribal communities, and asking them, how can we make this information useful to you? Is there any way that we can make these intersections happen? And it's really exciting to be able to, you know, when you can do that, to be involved in that kind of work. And there's a link to a really great story here about some of the work that's going on by communities in the area on keeping indigenous foodways alive, if anyone is interested. Slide. And also, I would say, too, that, you know, communicating climate change impacts and cultural resources, that's been a big story. This, you can see Suntayea and Mike on the cover of the Historic Preservation Program 25th Annual Report. They made it, you know, they're big there. They've done, the Weather Channel has done stories about this, about how climate change threatens coastal archaeological sites. And it's, you know, we think it's important to get this information out there so the public is aware that, you know, there are threats, and that these threats are intensifying. Slide. And I think that's about all I have for you. And I'll say,
Shannon.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Okay, so let's open up the chat for questions. Anybody, you can just unmute your phone, ask a question, or type something into the chat. I can start, actually. I have a question for Suntayea. I'm curious if that earlier era of excavations, like the Gold and the Murado excavations, had entered part of Tolowa Nation history. Was that discussed as contributing to history, or is that era of archaeology sort of lost in time? And I imagine that this re-examination of the materials and the sharing and the collaborative nature of this would have had more of an impact. But.
Actually, I mean, as part of when I was working in the TIPO office, and we were also working with the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act grant, we were able to visit Berkeley and some of their collections and start looking at, you know, what was recovered from those sites. But we didn't really get into the actual detailed information. And part of the projects that we were working on was we sent out numerous letters to various agencies requesting that they share the information that they had regarding Tolowa Dee-ni and do like a collaborative effort. And Redwood National State Parks, Karen Grantham and Mike Peterson, they were the ones that really, and Bo were able to like give us information, and truly they're the only agency to the date, I mean, after I left, or before I left, actually sent us the information that they had, and we were able to go through these old documents and see some of the, interviews and things like that. And we were also collaborated with Elk Valley, and they were able to get some of the gold interview. They were like these little, Shannon, do you remember those little cards? And they were like interview cards. And just being able to read back on the information that was gathered. And so, I mean, we have been able to use it a little bit, but I would hope that, we can access that information even more, get more information from that, and then also, be able to build our own archives within the tribes ourselves. And then moving forward, we would also be able to provide that out if we so choose. So,
cool.
Does that make sense? Did I answer the question?
Yeah, very cool, very cool.
Okay. I know, is Krista on the phone? Like, Krista, did you have anything from Elk Valley, or? Not to just call you out, but.
Krista's a little occupied right now. This is Kevin with Elk Valley.
Oh, hey, Kevin.
Yeah, hey, how you doing?
Hey.
Hey, thanks everybody for their work. This has been a long time in the making, and I want to just take the opportunity to thank everybody for their hard work.
Thanks, Kevin.
And definitely thank you, Kevin, and Krista at Elk Valley, and John Green and others there. And that's one of the things I definitely wanted to say in our final acknowledgments and appreciation for everybody's help. Working with the tribes has been fantastic, and it's just that collaborative working relationship. We just want to let everybody know our sincere appreciation for that. There's a lot of other people. I'd like to also thank, of course, Shannon in Washington State, her colleagues up there. Fantastic work, Shannon. Humboldt State University worked with me great out there when we were excavating the site there. Of course, Karen Grantham, my supervisor, got to mention her, and Kirsty Hartell, Dave Louder from the National Park Service there, for getting us this funding. Without that funding, it would have been tough to do all this. So thank them very much, and the Park Service, of course. Also, Midwest Archaeological Center, we've got, I think Jay Sturdivant was on the phone there. And so Steve DeVord from down there did some excellent work for the geophysical work for before we even started excavating. And, of course, our support from our management here at Redwood, it was fantastic, and the follow-up with the maintenance group there to help install the fence. So appreciate everybody's help and collaboration. And, again, definitely the tribe, it's been a great experience. I hope to continue.
Great. Do we have any other questions out there? Any questions?
Hey, I have a question. This is Chris Allen from Midwest Archaeological Center, actually. I was going to see, this is kind of open-ended, but to Shannon, Suntayea, and Mike, you guys talked about long-term relationship development. I was wondering if you guys had, and it sounds like, it sounds super successful, your project, but as people move on throughout their careers, Shannon, you mentioned going from TIPO to WSU, Suntayea from TIPO to not being in TIPO anymore, and then Mike being in MPS. I was wondering if you could speak to your experiences as people move, other projects come about. How do you keep a project so strong and continue it into a long-term relationship goal? And I know that's super open-ended, but if you guys have any advice or experiences.
That's a good question, actually. Mike, do you want to take that one? I think because Mike is the hub right now, and
yeah. one of the things I've found is, working with various groups is, you make good relationships with a few people, and that grapevine effect will continue on. It's just working with some tribal people, and you get to know them, and people, they might move on, but if you left a good legacy, you can always call them up as friends and good colleagues, and those relationships have been developed, and they're good, solid relationships. Those people will tell their family members or in the tribe or other people in the tribe. So it's a lot of times word of mouth really gets around, and so when you develop good relationships, I think no matter where you go, your work and working with people will follow you.
And I think too, this is Suntayea, reflecting back on what worked. So if you're the person that's still there, I think it's just important that you just keep in the same vein that you were working. You just continue, and you know that unfortunately you might have to start building a relationship with the new person or whoever else is in there, but just keeping it with that same tone, I think, because you know that is successful by being respectful, communicating, doing all those things. You're going to hit roadblocks no matter what, because that just happens when, we're all working together. But in the end, that's a formula for success, is just to maintain and develop that relationship, even if you have to start back with a new person. But having that foundation is, to me, vital for that collaborative model.
I would share, too, that, this kind of goes back Richard Gould was somebody that, in my experience, he was in the area working in the early 1960s, and I think that he was really a respectful archaeologist. He developed these long-term relationships with Mrs. Brown and other elders, and he kept in touch with those people over the years. He wasn't somebody that just kind of was, moving through the area, got his data, and then moved on without checking in with people. And I think, and that was, 60 years ago or whatever, before I started working in the area. People remembered that, that some of the elders that I spoke to said, oh yeah, I heard things about, Richard Gould and working with Grandma Amelia Brown, and those relationships actually can reverberate decades later. I guess that's my point. And I've seen in other areas where there are archaeologists did not have that kind of respectful relationship with indigenous communities, and those places, I think that's affected the tone of a lot of the cultural resources work that has occurred in these neighboring places. So, not to put any pressure on you, but people are kind of, it does make a difference how we work in these communities, even when we're gone. I guess that's what wanted to say.
Can I just add in one more thing?
Yeah.
Another thing I was hoping, to try to convey today too is also knowing each other's processes. So that was one of the things that was kind of, I wouldn't say difficult, but I mean sometimes it would put different obstacles, because let's say you have your timeline that you have to get something done, and it doesn't fit within the frame of one tribe, and then maybe the other tribe or another tribe or whoever, their program or their government has their own way of running things and their processes. And so I think really learning what those are individually is so important, because then you're able to, if you need to facilitate your own deadline, but also help facilitate through the deadlines of the other parties helps, because we're all different. We're all sovereign governments, and understanding that and being respectful to each other's timelines also makes for smooth work no matter who's working in those positions.
Great. Thanks for your responses, guys. Yeah, I look forward to doing more collaboration in the future and continuing those sorts of relationships.
Cool, thanks.
I have another question. This is Mike Roller. In the paper, you say that one of the sort of fundamental project themes that was borne out was the Tolowa management of the environment in the long durée, which is a very rich theme that involves, continuities and past, present, and future. So I'd love to hear from each of you how this project sort of bore out that theme of the Tolowa Nation's management of the environment on the coast.
So who wants to start on that? I think so. Yeah, Elk Valley and Tolowa Dee-ni, they both are invested in. It's actually very cool because management in like sort of archaeological discourse, like we're sort of coming to terms better with the idea that people were not just passive consumers of the environment. Like they were managing the resources. They were burning. They were doing controlled burns. They were investing in habitat for plants and animals. They were masters of their ecologies. And, this is something that indigenous communities already knew. And we are just kind of, you're seeing more and more work around this kind of theme of management. Like, okay, people, and so archaeologists are really interested in understanding this over the long durée, so over thousands and thousands of years, and how have people interacted with plants and animals and their environment. And so it's really powerful to see today. When I was working as a TIPO, to see Elk Valley and Tolowa Dee-ni, they're just so actively engaged with trying to, it's not always easy because they often have roadblocks to management when they don't own land areas, but they are investing a tremendous amount of time in management today. So those connections to me that just seemed like a no-brainer in terms of a theme to emphasize in this work. Suntayea and Mike? Yeah.
Suntayea, would you like to go first?
Sure, thanks. I mean, just thinking about it, so in the past, if we're talking about Smelt Fish Camp, we have never missed a summer having a fish camp since before contact. And so even though it's been hard, like with access down to the beach and things like that, and dealing with homeowners associations and million-dollar houses and property, we still have accessed those areas and since the beginning of time for us. And so that's part of the past part. And then if you look at it for right now, we're still doing that and continuing to do that. But then also the tribe has an ocean governance team that is actually conducting smelt survey studies and trying to gather baseline data for smelt and the ocean, and trying to figure out possibly why we are not having the runs that we're having or we used to have. And then for the future would be using the data that we're able to gather from, this kind of work and information that was gathered, plus the information that's gathered present by the tribe, and then also tribal members watching the ocean, seeing what's going on, when are the runs, things like that, and then moving forward for the future generations that hopefully our kids will like smelt and be able to eat it, and our grandchildren. So that's kind of where those phases for us are, for me anyway.
Yeah, and thank you, Suntayea. That was great. I wanted to just follow up from your question, which regards tribal collaboration with managing NPS these administrated lands. What we've done here at Redwood National Park, what I always strive for is like I mentioned earlier in the discussions here, we're getting out in the field with tribal folks, really getting to know the tribe's culture and being involved in activities and knowing these people, knowing people and their culture. And so that allows us to know what they want. When we're out in the field, you know, I've talked to quite a few times when we're out in the field and people say, well, we'd sure like to have this land have prescribed fire here, because that was one of the things that we did for time and millennia. So I take that message back to our management, and we look at ways, we're looking at ways to get fire back on the ground in a lot of areas of the park here, and we take these ideas and things that are said in the field or in the office from tribal people seriously. If you know, everything from fire to better management of maybe surf fish beds. Look at ways to do that in the future, and of course just the cultural sites themselves. So really take what people say in the field, the tribes, the thoughts they have, and provide you really take those seriously and bring those back to management and try to implement those as best you can and continue to work with them. I actually on trail projects, we have an example of a trail up here that we incorporated tribal folks in, helping us actually line out the trail. Where would they think a trail would be best placed? And so working directly with tribes and finding funding to get them involved, and multiple other ways of just great collaboration and going to lunches and just a lot of interactions.
Great. Do we have any other questions out there? We have time for about one more. I have one last question, and if anyone wants to jump the gun ahead of me, that's fine. But one bit of dissonance between your findings and Murato's was the discovery of groundstone related to plant processing, because I think in the Murato conclusions there's a discussion that there was probably no plant processing at the site, and in fact your excavations turned them up. And I'm wondering if that's another sort of line of research that could go on, and also if there's Tolowa Nation accounts that might inform us about plant processing that went on at the site.
Yeah, that was something that, Murato was not convinced that plant processing was going on, but we're pretty sure that, I mean, acorns and other plant foods were really important throughout the area. And we know that this was a village site, so there were houses, and people would store a variety of foods, not just coastal foods, and they were interacting with each other. So I think some of our data also spoke to just that interconnection, those interconnections with other communities. And, you know, we see that in the obsidian sourcing data, which shows that people were connected to very distant locations where they were obtaining obsidian either through probably through exchange relationships, long distance exchange relationships, and really just plants. We know that plants were such a big part of the diet. So you know, there is work that could be done with some of the groundstone that would, you know, we could potentially request to do some pollen analysis, or we haven't done anything along those lines to look at the plant residues on groundstone, but that's something that we could look into for sure.
Great. All right. I think we're just about running out of time. I want to thank you guys so much for joining us for that fantastic presentation and great question and answer session. This concludes our ArcheoThursday Topics in Archaeology webinar. Stay tuned. We're going to take a little break for the holidays, and then we've got 2 great presentations coming up in probably in February and March. One is going to be on Lower Pecos Canyon pictograph site on the coast, on the border of Texas, and another one on Camp Monticello, an Italian POW camp in Arkansas. So thank you, everyone. Have great holidays. Keep warm if you're in a cold place. And thank my presenters again so much for the great presentation.
Thank you, Mike and Shannon. Definitely Suntayea there. Appreciate it. And everybody for tuning in.
Happy winter solstice.
Happy holidays.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.